I still remember the suffocating heat of Somalia pressing down on us like a vice, even though it's been months since that scorching day. My name is Christopher "Chris" Beaumont, and I was once an esteemed member of the Army Rangers, or so I thought. Our mission in Somalia was supposed to be straightforward, albeit dangerous. Gather intelligence on local warlords suspected of trafficking arms and narcotics, then secure the perimeter for a follow-up operation. What none of us anticipated, or at least what I naively failed to recognize, was the lurking betrayal among our own ranks. The day it all went wrong, I felt a peculiar tension in the air. Maybe it was the way Sergeant Dawson kept glancing at me, or how Lieutenant Carter seemed more withdrawn than usual. At the time, I attributed it to jitters, the normal anxiety any soldier faces when heading into hostile territory. We were a small unit, only 6 men, each trained to handle high-stakes operations. The sun was blazing, waves of heat rippling across the desert expanse, and the village we approached looked nothing like the strategic hotspot it was rumored to be. Instead, it seemed eerily quiet, almost too welcoming, as though it concealed a secret we were all too ignorant to see. Little did I know that the biggest secret lay not in the sand beneath our boots but within the hearts of the men I'd foolishly trusted with my life. I can still replay the moment when I realized something was amiss. Carter radioed in that we had to split into 2 teams, ensuring better coverage of the perimeter. I followed orders, taking Private Langley with me to investigate the southeastern quadrant of the village. The plan, as laid out, was for the others, Carter, Dawson, Banks, and more, to sweep the opposite side. Then, once any threats were identified, we'd reconvene near an abandoned structure that intelligence had flagged as a potential stash house. My first hint that something was horribly wrong came when Langley stumbled upon an empty shipping container. It was filled with crates of ammunition stamped with U.S. military codes, something that should not have been in the hands of local warlords. And there was more. Suspicious ledgers, notes in code that we couldn't decipher, and a locked metal box. We both looked at each other, sweat trickling down our faces, uncertain of what we'd stumbled upon. Before we could investigate further, a shot rang out. It wasn't an enemy sniper, it came from behind us. I spun around, heart thumping in my chest, to see Dawson standing there, rifle aimed, his face drawn in grim determination. Langley hit the ground before either of us could utter a single word. Hot rage and confusion pulsed through me. That's when it dawned on me. We'd been set up. The containers full of contraband, the coded documents. It seemed that Carter and Dawson, and possibly the others, were involved in some clandestine operation, siphoning weapons and selling them to local warlords. And because I stumbled upon their secret, because Langley and I found something we shouldn't have, I had just become a liability. I tried to raise my rifle, but Dawson was quicker. The butt of his weapon crashed against my head, and I slumped to the ground. Everything went black. By the time I came to, the village was a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. My head pounded, vision blurred, but I recognized Carter's voice on the radio, barking orders. Target neutralized, confirm kill. The rest of you, get out of there. I realized in horror that he was referring to me as the target. Half conscious, I reached for my sidearm. My fingers felt numb, but my training kicked in. I forced myself to roll behind a crumbling wall. Through a haze of pain, I managed to see them sprinting toward a helicopter extraction point. Before my eyes, my squad boarded the chopper, my so-called brothers in arms. The rotors kicked up clouds of sand, stinging my face. Then they were gone, leaving me behind, just as local militiamen poured into the area. I was captured within minutes. Still woozy and bleeding, I tried to fight back, but it was useless. I was tossed into the back of a dilapidated truck like a sack of grain, bound and gagged, while Carter's radio transmission echoed in my mind. Beaumont is Kia? He'd lied. They labeled me as killed in action, burying me under that false report. Those first days of captivity were an agonizing blur. I was taken to a small compound on the outskirts of Mogadishu, where I endured relentless interrogation. My captors wanted to know about the U.S. supply lines, about potential infiltration points, about the weapons in that container. Sometimes they demanded information about my squad, but I refused to speak. They starved me, beat me, subjected me to torture techniques that turned my nights into an endless loop of nightmares. Yet ironically, each day I survived felt like a twisted victory. I told myself I would not break, not when I had so many unanswered questions, and especially not while I still had a chance, however small, to bring my betrayers to justice. Time blurred. I lost track of day and night, never seeing the sun. My captors kept me locked in a grimy cell with a single, flickering bulb overhead. In that half-light, my mind wandered to Carter's betrayal. I tried to recall every detail from our previous missions, searching for clues I'd missed. The hush of money that changed hands in secret, coded conversations I'd half overheard, the suspicious trips Carter and Dawson took when they claimed to be on official errands. How could I have been so blind? And, above all, why? I kept thinking of Langley, the bright-eyed kid who joined the Rangers to make a difference in the world. He'd wanted to fight for justice, but he never got the chance. They murdered him in cold blood. I realized I owed it to Langley, as much as to myself, to stay alive. Because if I died in that filthy cell, no one would ever know the truth. No one would ever hold Carter and the others accountable for their crimes. Anger burned inside me like a furnace, and it became my fuel, my reason to survive. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, or so it seemed. I clung to the hope of escape, studying every guard rotation, every vent, every door, waiting for that fleeting moment when my captors would drop their guard. Finally, one night, a new group of men came in. They were rougher, more violent than the rest. Their leader was a warlord named Jama, who boasted about the riches he'd gained from foreign soldiers dealing in stolen weapons. He seemed to relish the idea of torturing an American Ranger, hoping perhaps to gain more leverage in whatever underhanded deals he had with outside operatives. That's how I discovered that Carter and Dawson had made deals with Jama, delivering shipments of arms in exchange for large sums of money that they presumably laundered through overseas accounts. That knowledge stoked my hatred to new heights, but it also gave me a crucial insight. My captors were as vulnerable to double-crossing as they were capable of betrayal themselves. Jama underestimated me, as did his men. They figured that after months of captivity, I was too weak, too broken to pose a threat. But they forgot one important aspect of Army Ranger training: resilience. Every day in captivity, I did covert exercises to keep my body from deteriorating. I waited for openings, for chances to manipulate the guards. By paying close attention, I realized that Jama's men were lazy when it came to maintaining their hold on me. They believed themselves invincible in their own territory. The night of my escape came when a fierce sandstorm swept across the region. Winds howled, ripping through the flimsy barricades surrounding the compound. Visibility was nearly zero outside, and the guard shifts were chaotic. In that storm, many of Jama's men huddled inside to avoid getting pelted by debris. For me, that was the perfect cover. Using a broken piece of metal I'd managed to smuggle, I pried at the hinges of my cell door. My hands trembled, a mix of fear and excitement, but eventually, the door gave way. I slipped into the hallway, each footstep carefully placed. The electricity flickered, creating strobing bursts of light that turned the corridor into a nightmare scene. Guards passed by occasionally, their faces half hidden by the swirling dust that seeped through shattered windows. Holding my breath, I crept behind one guard, grabbed him in a chokehold, and dragged his unconscious body into a dark corner. I took his rifle and a small sidearm, adrenaline surging through my veins. Felt surreal. After so many weeks of torture, I was finally the one with the upper hand. Slipping through the compound, I stayed close to walls, using every shadow to hide. More than once, I nearly ran into a patrolling guard, but the storm's roar masked my footsteps, allowing me to evade detection. Eventually, I reached an area where the vehicles were parked. Most were old, battered pickup trucks with mounted machine guns, typical of local militias. But all I needed was something that ran. I hot-wired a Jeep and barreled through the main gate. Gunfire erupted behind me, bullets pinging off the metal frames. But in the chaos of the storm, their aim was wild. My heart hammered as I steered blindly, trusting luck and years of driving under fire. By the time the storm subsided, I had crossed miles of deserted roads, forging a path to safety. Reaching friendly territory took days of dodging roving bands of militiamen, bribing local guides with what little I had, and slipping past checkpoints. My body was weak, my wounds still fresh, but rage and determination propelled me. When I finally found a small contingent of Allied forces near the coastline, they were stunned to discover a lone, ragged American ranger stumbling into their outpost. After that, it didn't take long for me to get whisked away to a secure facility where military intelligence debriefed me. They were astonished to hear my story, that Lieutenant Carter and Sergeant Dawson, among others, had orchestrated gun-running operations, that they had faked my death to eliminate a witness, and that they were probably still laundering money through covert channels. But shock didn't translate into immediate action. There was red tape, official channels, and concerns about implicating multiple high-ranking figures. Rumors of corruption ran deeper than I ever imagined, and it seemed that some individuals in higher command might prefer to sweep the entire incident under the rug to avoid scandal. I wouldn't stand for it. After everything I'd endured, I refused to let the matter fade into obscurity. If the official route failed, I vowed to take justice into my own hands. And so, once cleared medically, I silently left the secure facility, avoiding unnecessary attention. Armed with intelligence gleaned from my captivity, I began planning the ultimate operation. One man against a network of conspirators who had tried to bury me. The first step to tracking them down was to figure out where my former squadmates had scattered. According to the official records, I was still marked as Kia. That worked in my favor, because they never expected me to return from the grave. Dawson was the easiest to find. A creature of habit, he had a known weakness for flashy cars and expensive living. It wasn't hard to trace the suspicious bank deposits under a shell corporation he'd established. The man apparently believed he was untouchable, openly buying real estate and funneling money through a chain of shady businesses in the American Southwest. I made my way to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where rumors suggested Dawson was hiding in plain sight. I didn't have the resources of the army behind me, but I had something more potent. A thirst for justice and a skill set honed in countless covert operations. Blending into the city, I rented a small, dingy apartment, the kind where neighbors ask no questions and the landlord is too indifferent to care who comes and goes. Then I set up a surveillance routine tracking Dawson's known associates, watching for patterns. It amazed me how quickly he'd found comfort after his treachery. Dawson frequented an upscale bar downtown, often accompanied by what looked like bodyguards. At first glance, you'd think he was just another wealthy entrepreneur. But I recognized the ex-military stance of his companions, the careful way they scanned every environment. Clearly, Dawson was paranoid, but not paranoid enough to imagine I was on his trail. Following him day after day, I pieced together his routine. He met with shady figures who arrived in tinted SUVs, engaged in hushed conversations that reeked of illegal deals, then left with thick envelopes. My mind flashed back to the shipping container in Somalia, the coded ledgers, all those weapons. Dawson was still at it, or else he'd found some new angle to exploit. My blood boiled, but I kept cool. Revenge requires patience, calculation. One misstep, and I'd alert him to my presence before I could bring him down. I decided to strike when he least expected it, at a high-profile charity gala he'd agreed to sponsor through one of his shell companies. The event was scheduled at a ritzy hotel, the type with red carpet entrances and champagne toasts. Dawson planned to use it as a front to launder more money, making himself look like a philanthropist in the process. I spent weeks forging an invitation. Posing as a legitimate donor with a fictional real estate portfolio, I infiltrated the gala. Dressed in a borrowed tuxedo, hair neatly combed, I blended seamlessly with the crowd of wealthy socialites. My rifle was nowhere in sight. Tonight wasn't about a firefight. I needed public humiliation and undeniable evidence. In a digital age, the best weapon can be hard proof. Moving through the crowd with practiced elegance, I introduced myself to donors and guests, making sure to remain inconspicuous. All the while, I kept an eye on Dawson. He was in his element, charming the unsuspecting, smiling for photos, ignoring the moral rot that seethed beneath his polished exterior. A contact of mine, a skilled hacker named Riley, had managed to intercept emails between Dawson and his offshore accounts. She'd compiled incriminating files detailing money laundering, illegal arms sales, and even references to my supposed death in Somalia, hinting at how they'd arranged to have me declared Kia. That night, just as Dawson stepped onto the stage to deliver a speech about generosity and community support, I quietly approached the event's AV booth. Pretending to be a technician, I slid a USB drive into the system. Seconds later, the projector screen behind Dawson lit up with a different set of slides. At first, the crowd thought it was part of the presentation. But as the text and images became clear, bank transfers, shipping manifests, covert communications, an audible gasp swept across the audience. Dawson froze mid-sentence, eyes darting to the screen as the truth about his criminal empire displayed for everyone to see. Security rushed to cut the feed, but it was too late. People had taken out their phones, snapping pictures, recording videos. The hush in the ballroom turned into a roar of shock and indignation. Dawson's carefully crafted image shredded before him. I watched from the shadows as law enforcement, prompted by the trove of evidence released to them simultaneously by Riley, stormed the venue. Dawson tried to run, but I intercepted him in a small hallway near the kitchen. He stared at me, eyes wide, as though seeing a ghost. You're dead," he stammered, voice trembling. I smirked, my heart pounding. "You left me for dead," I corrected. "Big difference." He went for his sidearm, hidden under his tailored jacket, but I anticipated the move. A quick disarm, a swift strike to his solar plexus, and he collapsed to his knees. Grabbing him by the collar, I leaned in close enough for him to feel my breath on his face. "This is just the beginning," I hissed. "You're going to answer for everything, for Langley, for the torture I endured, for betraying our country. You will never see freedom again." In the distance, I heard the shouts of officers and the frantic scramble of guests. I dropped Dawson to the floor, letting the authorities find him. As they handcuffed him, I slipped away, unseen amid the confusion. The first betrayer had fallen. The next target was private first-class banks. Though never as cunning as Carter or Dawson, Banks had played a role in abandoning me. According to intel, he was now working as private security for a defense contractor based in Northern Virginia. Banks was the type who always needed direction, someone to tell him what to do, and it seemed he'd found a boss willing to pay for his muscle without asking too many questions about his past. I traveled to Virginia, where the rolling suburbs conceal many a secret behind manicured lawns. I located the contractor's main offices in a nondescript building near Arlington. Banks served as a guard, and ironically, his tasks were routine: scanning IDs, patting down employees, and ensuring security for an organization that specialized in logistic support for the military. If only they knew they had a traitor on their payroll. Gathering evidence against Banks was more straightforward than I anticipated. He'd been bragging at a local veterans bar about his special ops background, exaggerating his role in covert missions. Some nights, after a few too many drinks, he let slip hints of illegal deals he'd facilitated in Somalia. The bartender, a fellow veteran who took pride in discretion, was troubled by Banks's arrogance and confided in me. I knew I had the perfect setup: a sting operation. Late one evening, I approached Banks at the bar wearing civilian clothes. He was slumped over his drink, complaining about money troubles. Ironically enough, the funds he'd siphoned from gun running had dried up after Dawson's downfall. "If only I had a few more of those sweet contracts," he groaned to his drinking buddy, not realizing I was listening in from a nearby stool. "Somalia was a goldmine, man, if not for that ranger messing everything up. Dawson said we'd have enough to retire. Now I'm stuck here, earning scraps." I felt my anger flare, but I stayed composed. That's when I slid closer, acting as though I was just another stranger with a sympathetic ear. Banks looked at me through bleary eyes, failing to recognize me in the dimly lit bar. Maybe my face had changed, hardened by the ordeals I'd faced, or perhaps he just wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. I started probing him for details, pretending to be curious about discreet ways to make a little extra cash in the defense sector. Banks, gullible as ever, took the bait. In his drunken stupor, he boasted about having contacts overseas, Men who could move anything from weapons to classified data, if the price was right. He bragged about his time in Somalia, about tying up loose ends. My stomach churned when he gloated about how they had left the ranger behind. But I forced myself to maintain the facade. Eventually, he grew suspicious of my questions, but by then, it was too late. I'd recorded everything. With those recordings, I secured a meeting with a federal agent who was investigating private security firms for illegal dealings. Though the agent was initially skeptical, after all, official records showed I was Kia. I managed to convince him by providing government-issued ID and evidence of my captivity. I showed him the data, the recordings, and an organized timeline connecting Banks's confessions to the events in Somalia. The agent, somewhat taken aback by my story, agreed to arrange a sting operation if I could lure Banks into one final incriminating act. A week later, in an abandoned parking garage in Arlington, the trap was sprung. I convinced Banks I had a buyer for stolen military tech and that I wanted him to broker the deal. He arrived, eyes darting nervously, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. I waited behind a concrete pillar, hidden in shadow, as the federal team observed from a secure vantage point. When Banks opened the duffel, revealing official documents that were definitely restricted, I stepped forward, letting him see my face in the harsh fluorescent light. He went pale as a ghost, realization dawning. You're dead," he muttered, echoing Dawson's disbelief. His hand trembled for the gun at his waist, but the feds converged, shouting for him to drop his weapon. Cornered, Banks looked at me with an odd mixture of terror and shame, as though he realized how far he'd fallen. He tried to plead for mercy, but my hardened glare told him there'd be none. Agents cuffed him, collecting the bag of stolen documents, while I stood there, heart pounding with grim satisfaction. Another domino had fallen. Sergeant Moore proved more elusive. He was a chameleon, adept at changing identities, forging passports, and disappearing into the underbelly of foreign cities. Rumor had it he'd fled the U.S. and was operating out of a safe house somewhere in Eastern Europe, possibly moving contraband for Russian syndicates. Moore had been part of Carter's circle for years, rumored to be the man who could falsify any document. If I wanted to track him, I had to think like a fugitive. I scoured underground networks, calling in favors, sometimes threatening minor criminals to glean any scrap of information. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Moore seemed to have a particular affinity for gambling. Reports placed him in Budapest, where high-stakes poker tournaments in hidden casinos were a common pastime for shady types looking to launder dirty money. It fit Moore's profile perfectly. In Budapest, I delved into the city's nightlife, drifting from one smoky gambling den to the next, searching for any sign of the sergeant who had vanished without a trace. Eventually, I found a lead. An aging gambler muttered about an American who went by the name Gray, known for suspiciously large cash buy-ins and an uncanny knack for forging identities. That had to be Moore. I finally cornered him at a private poker game in the back room of a dingy bar near the Danube River. He sat at a round table covered in green felt, cards fanned out in his hand, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He'd grown a beard, dyed his hair, and wore tinted glasses, but there was no mistaking him. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I watched from a distance, letting him believe his world was secure. When the game ended, he collected his winnings and slipped outside, strolling down a quiet alleyway. That's where I made my move. Stepping from the shadows, I pressed a gun to his back, instructing him to keep walking as though nothing was amiss. At first, he stiffened, ready to resist, but something in my tone, or perhaps the desperate edge in my voice, convinced him not to be rash. We entered a deserted lot, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. He turned, squinting at me, trying to discern who dared to corner him. When recognition hit, his face contorted with shock. "Beaumont," he whispered, voice trembling. "We left you. We were told you. Save it." I growled, my resentment boiling over. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You sold me out. You watched them leave me to die." He started to open his mouth, maybe to plead innocence or spin some excuse, but I slammed him against a brick wall, gun pressed firmly to his temple. My heart hammered, adrenaline turning my anger into a near uncontrollable force. "You think you can run forever?" I snarled. "Your luck just ran out." His eyes darted around, searching for some escape, but I had the advantage. The next minutes were a blur of tension as I forced him to reveal the extent of his operation. He stammered that Carter was the real mastermind, that he'd just followed orders, that he never wanted to leave me behind. Lies, all of it, delivered with the trembling desperation of a cornered man. I demanded the location of Carter, the proof of every illegal transaction. Sensing he might still wriggle free, I realized I needed more than a confession in an alleyway. I forced Moore to log into his encrypted accounts on a handheld device I carried. Under the threat of my weapon, he provided access to a trove of incriminating data. Not just about Carter, but about his entire network of corrupt officials, arms dealers, and even mercenaries who had helped them in Somalia. He also had digital copies of communications that explicitly detailed the plan to leave me behind. They laughed at how they'd tricked me into searching the container, setting me up as the sacrificial lamb. Reading those messages nearly pushed me over the edge, my finger tightening on the trigger. But vengeance is best served with precise, calculated blows. Killing Moore in that dark alley would have been easy, but it would have also been too quick, too clean. Instead, I used a set of zip ties to bind him, confiscated his phone, and made a discreet call to local authorities through contacts I'd established earlier that day. In a city rife with corruption, it took some bribes to ensure they'd take him into custody rather than let him slip away. By the time the sirens echoed through the alley, I had vanished, leaving Moore trussed up like the traitor he was, surrounded by the mountains of evidence he'd so helpfully unveiled. Now all roads led to Carter, the man who had orchestrated it all. The man who had fired that final, fateful radio message declaring me Kia. The man who'd stood by as Dawson shot Langley in cold blood. If there was a devil wearing a ranger uniform, it was Lieutenant Carter. With Dawson arrested, Banks caught, and Moore in European custody, Carter had presumably gone to ground. But even a rattlesnake has a nest, and I knew exactly where Carter would seek refuge, with the kind of powerful connections that only come from the highest levels of corruption. As it turned out, Carter was holed up in a heavily fortified estate on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., protected by private security and, rumor had it, political allies who owed him favors. The estate was rumored to host lavish parties for influential figures, ensuring Carter's protection through blackmail and bribery. He'd lost some of his network after the arrests of Dawson and Banks, but he still had formidable defenses. Approaching the estate with guns blazing would have been suicide. Instead, I leveraged the data Moore had provided, carefully selecting the most incriminating files to expose Carter's role in Somalia. I also uncovered Carter's involvement in the broader arms trafficking conspiracy, not just in Somalia but across multiple conflict zones. The plan was twofold. First, isolate Carter by cutting off his allies, then corner him with the truth until there was nowhere left to hide. Using Moore's encrypted phone, I impersonated him, sending Carter urgent messages about a pending deal in Somalia that threatened to blow their entire operation wide open. I hinted that officials were close to freezing their accounts, that the money pipeline was at risk. Carter, sensing imminent disaster, demanded a face-to-face meeting, instructing Moore to come to the estate immediately. I arrived under the cover of darkness, wearing a tactical vest laden with gear reminiscent of my ranger days. My heart pounded as the gates loomed ahead, guarded by armed men. Slipping through the perimeter required a combination of stealth, distraction devices, and the darkest corners of the estate's vast grounds. I neutralized 2 guards quietly, ensuring they remained unconscious but alive. I was here for Carter, not for needless bloodshed. At last, I reached the inner courtyard. Carter stood there, waiting under a gazebo lit by soft yellow lights. He was older than I remembered, thinner, with sharper lines etched into his face. Stress had worn him down, but his eyes still held that calculating glint. He clutched a folder in one hand, a pistol resting on a nearby table. He clearly expected more, so I watched from a concealed position as he paced back and forth, checking his watch, cursing under his breath. Finally, I emerged from the shadows, stepping into the pool of light. His eyes widened in fear and disbelief. "Beaumont," he said, voice shaking.
Impossible.
We left you." "Yeah, you left me?" I spat, stepping closer. "But I survived. Months of torture, all because of your greed. And now I'm here to make you answer for everything." Carter's hand darted to the pistol on the table. I dashed forward, knocking it aside before he could aim, the gun clattering to the ground. We circled each other, the tension a tangible force pressing against us. "Don't be a fool," Carter hissed. "You can't take me down. I have powerful friends, men in high places who rely on me. You'll vanish again, but this time you won't come back." I sneered. "I doubt that. Dawson, Banks, Moore, they're all gone. Whatever friends you have left, they're running out of time." Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind me. 2 more guards rushed into the courtyard. Carter lunged for his pistol again, but I spun, drawing my own sidearm. 2 shots rang out in the night. The guards dropped, wounded but not killed. Carter seized the momentary distraction to tackle me. We crashed to the ground, grappling in a tangle of limbs. He landed a blow to my ribcage, pain exploding through me, but I fought through it. My elbow struck his jaw, dazing him. We rolled apart, both panting, hearts hammering. Carter scrambled to his feet, desperate. He yanked a dagger from a hidden sheath, slashing wildly. I dodged, the blade whistling inches from my face. Summoning my remaining strength, I parried his arm, twisting his wrist until the dagger clattered to the stone floor. The next strike sent him reeling. His body slammed into a marble column, and he slid down in a daze, blood trickling from his lip, breath ragged. I approached, sidearm aimed at his trembling form. "This is for Langley," I hissed, voice shaking with pent-up rage. He looked up at me, terror plain on his face. For a moment I considered pulling the trigger. A single shot could end him, avenge Langley, avenge every tortured night I spent in captivity. It would be so easy. Yet, in that crucial moment, I remembered why I joined the Rangers, to protect justice, not to become an executioner. Carter's death wouldn't bring Langley back. It wouldn't erase my scars. And it wouldn't undo the corruption that allowed men like him to thrive. I lowered my gun, stepping away. Sirens wailed in the distance. Lights flashed over the estate's walls as a coordinated raid began. I had tipped off multiple agencies, providing them with the location and Carter's many crimes. Even a few corrupt officials wouldn't be able to ignore such overwhelming evidence. Carter tried to scramble to his feet, but I pinned him down, pressing my knee into his back until the authorities poured into the courtyard. When they took him into custody, Carter's eyes met mine one last time. There was no repentance, only hatred and fear. "This isn't over," he rasped. But we both knew it was a hollow threat. The empire he built on betrayal was crumbling around him, undone by the Ranger he left behind. I slipped out before the authorities could detain me for questioning. My mission was done. The men who abandoned me to rot in Somalia would never see the light of freedom again. Dawson, Banks, Moore, Carter, each faced the destruction of their reputations, the seizure of their illegal wealth, and the full force of the law. Justice was finally within reach. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the scandal hit the headlines. High-ranking officials launched investigations, revealing a web of corruption that extended further than I'd ever imagined. My name emerged in the news, though not the full story. Authorities admitted that I wasn't Kia, that a grave administrative error had been made, and they subtly acknowledged that I had played a role in exposing a massive conspiracy. I didn't care for the spotlight. What mattered was that the truth came out, that the ghosts of Somalia were finally laid to rest. Months later, I found myself standing at a modest gravestone in a quiet cemetery in Pennsylvania. The name on it read, Private James Langley, beloved son, loyal friend, fallen hero. No one had ever questioned the official version of his death, that he died during the operation in Somalia. But now, at least, the truth was known to me and a few good men who still believed in honor. I placed a small bouquet of fresh flowers at his headstone, my throat tight with regret. "I'm sorry," I whispered. You deserved better, we both did. I hope you can rest now, knowing they paid for what they did. A gentle wind stirred the leaves around me. For the first time since my captivity, I felt a semblance of peace. I'd done everything I could to set things right. The men who betrayed me and Langley would never again misuse their uniforms for personal gain. They would face prison terms, public disgrace, and the lifelong stain of their crimes. As I walked away, a sense of closure settled in. I was free, truly free, from the shadows of that torturous cell in Somalia, from the betrayal that nearly cost me my life. The road ahead remained uncertain. I had no permanent home, no official rank, just the raw satisfaction of justice served. But I felt a small flame of hope flicker inside me, a belief that maybe, after all this, there could be a future untainted by rage and vengeance. A few days later, I got a call from an unexpected source. The Army's Office of Special Investigations. They wanted me to help root out corruption in other deployments, to train new recruits so they'd be able to identify the warning signs I'd missed. It was a second chance of sorts, an opportunity to use my skills for something good, to ensure that no one else would ever be abandoned by their squad or left to rot in a foreign prison because of the greed of a few. I boarded a plane, not as the broken man who escaped Somalia, but as someone forging a new path. Outside the window, the clouds stretched over the horizon, and I thought of all the people I'd lost, all the battles I'd endured. Life would never be the same, but at least now, there was a glimmer of light ahead. With the final step in my mission complete, the haunting images of that fateful day in Somalia began to soften. In their place, I felt an unaccustomed warmth, something that felt like relief or even redemption. And while I knew the darkness might never fully vanish, I also understood that I had reclaimed control of my destiny. From here on, I would live on my own terms, free from betrayal, free from the ghosts that once haunted every corner of my mind. Yes, I had been left behind by my squad in Somalia, declared Kia to cover their crimes. But I fought my way back, harnessing my training, my wits, and the unbreakable drive to expose the men who wronged me. In the end, justice prevailed, and though my scars, physical and mental, would never fully fade, I had found a new purpose. A purpose rooted in truth, integrity, and the promise that if betrayal should ever rear its ugly head again, I'd be there to stand against it. And so I moved forward with cautious optimism, determined to carve out a future unmarred by the evils of the past, hopeful that at long last, I had earned the right to find some measure of peace, and maybe even a measure of happiness, in a world I once thought had forsaken me.